The year is 1200 BC. The greatest civilizations the world had ever seen were all clustered around the Mediterranean and Near East. These empires were rich, powerful, and incredibly advanced for their time. They traded with each other, married into each other's royal families, and shared ideas that had been flowing back and forth for generations. Everything seemed stable. Everything seemed permanent. And then it all fell apart. In less than a single lifetime, this entire world crumbled. Empires that had stood for centuries simply vanished. Cities burned. Trade routes went silent. People starved. The chaos was so complete that in some places, humanity actually forgot how to read and write, and it would take almost 500 years to remember. This wasn't just a rough patch in history. This was the end of the world as they knew it. So how did anyone make it through? How do you survive when civilization itself collapses around you? Here's how people actually survived after the Bronze Age collapse. So yeah, if these stories work for you, subscribe. And I'm curious, what time is it where you are? Comment below. Last week, someone from Canada said they listened during lunch breaks. Not judging, just wasn't expecting that. Okay, tonight it's the Bronze Age collapse. But hold on, get yourself comfortable first. I mean it. Fix your pillows, grab that blanket. This one's worth settling in for. Your eyes snap open to darkness. Something's wrong. The air tastes different, smoky, sharp with fear. You're not in your bed. You're lying on a rough-woven mat in a small mud brick house, and there's shouting outside. Not the casual kind of shouting, the panic kind, the we're all going to die kind. You stumble to the single window, a small opening cut in thick walls. The city you see isn't the prosperous Bronze Age metropolis it was just months ago. Half the buildings are charred ruins. The Grand Palace at the centre, once gleaming with wealth, is a blackened skeleton against the sky. People are running, carrying whatever they can. Some have carts piled high with possessions. Others just have the clothes on their backs. They're coming again, an old man wheezes as he hurries past. The mountain people, the city walls won't hold this time. And just like that, you're experiencing the Bronze Age collapse firsthand. Not like right now, where you're warm and safe in your cozy bed in the 21st century. No, you're in the middle of civilization's greatest catastrophe until that point in history. Let's take a step back. Wait, I need to paint you a picture first. Imagine our world today, but instead of global networks of trade with ships and planes and the internet, it's all concentrated in a single region, the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East, Egypt, Greece, Turkey, Syria, Iraq. This was where human civilization reached its peak in 1200 BC. I spent way too long researching this period, and honestly, it blows my mind how advanced these societies were. You've got the Egyptians with their massive temples and bureaucracy, the Hittites with their chariots and iron working, the Mycenaeans with their palaces and epic poetry, Babylonians with their astronomical observations. These weren't primitive societies. They had international diplomacy where kings called each other brother in letters. They had trade routes spanning thousands of miles. They'd written legal codes and complex religion and professional armies. Think about it like this. If modern global civilization collapsed tomorrow, that's basically what happened to these people. Except they couldn't move to another continent where things were still okay. Their entire known world went up in flames. So who survived this apocalypse? Well, to understand that, we need to first look at who didn't make it. Let's start with the obvious. kings, queens, nobles, priests, the whole ruling class. These fine folks were usually the first to go. And I'm not just talking about foreign invaders targeting them. Their own people often turned on them. Picture this. You're some Bronze Age king. You've spent decades telling everyone how the gods chose you personally to rule, how you alone can ensure prosperity and safety. Then suddenly there's famine, there's war, people are starving, and you're still living in your palace surrounded by gold. How long before someone says, hey, maybe this guy isn't actually divinely appointed? Maybe he's just a dude with a fancy hat who's terrible at his job? Not very long, it turns out. Archaeological evidence shows many palaces were burned not by invaders, but from within. The people who'd once bowed to these rulers now blamed them for everything going wrong. But wait, you're thinking, couldn't they just send in the army to control the people? Well, that brings us to the second group that didn't do great. Military men. Professional soldiers were highly dependent on the palace economy. They needed centralized organization, steady food supplies, and specialized weapons. Once the system started breaking down, armies fractured. Some stayed loyal, many didn't. Either way, their life expectancy dropped drastically. The collapse didn't discriminate between those who fought with swords and those who fought with pens. Scribes, basically anyone who could read and write, mostly disappeared. We know this because writing itself vanishes from many regions. In Greece, writing completely disappears for almost 500 years after the collapse. Think about that. Not a single written word for 5 centuries. It's like if no one wrote anything from the American Revolution until today. Here's the thing about specialized knowledge. It's fragile. It depends on stability, on having the luxury to spend years learning instead of just surviving. When everything falls apart, people don't have time to teach their kids how to form complex symbols on clay tablets. They're too busy teaching them how to not starve. And speaking of starving, farmers didn't fare much better. These were the backbone of every Bronze Age society, the absolute majority of the population. But farming in many regions depended on complex irrigation systems that required maintenance and coordination. Once those systems were destroyed by war or neglect, the fields dried up. Plus, farmers make easy targets. They can't just pick up and leave. Their livelihood is literally rooted in the ground. When marauders came through, farmers had 2 choices: abandon everything they knew or stay and probably die. Then there were the city folk, your craftsmen, merchants, administrators, and labourers. Think of the butcher, the baker, the bronze chariot wheel maker. City in the Bronze Age were not self-sufficient. They existed because the surrounding countryside produced enough surplus food to support non-farming specialists. When that system collapsed, cities became death traps. No food coming in, disease spreading fast, angry mobs forming in the streets, and invaders at the gates. Not exactly a recipe for longevity. I've been to archaeological sites from this period. You want to know what the layers from the collapse look like? Ash. Thick, black layers of ash, mixed with broken pottery and scattered bones. Sometimes you find skeletons in the streets, in doorways, under collapsed roofs. People who didn't get out in time. The destruction was not merely of buildings, one archaeologist told me, but of entire ways of life. Imagine you're in that city I described earlier. The walls are breached. The palace is burning. What do you do? Where do you go? How do you survive when everything you've known is literally going up in flames? Your options aren't great. The countryside is overrun by desperate people and opportunistic raiders. Other cities are falling just like yours. The kings and nobles who once ruled have either been killed or fled. The temples that stored grain for hard times have been looted. The world is suddenly a much darker, more dangerous place. But here's the wild thing. Some people did survive. Not many from the old order, but enough to eventually rebuild, though in very different forms, and their stories of survival are fascinating. Take Egypt, for example. While almost every other major civilization completely collapsed, Egypt managed to limp on, though as a shadow of its former self. How? Through a brutal combination of military power, political adaptation, and sometimes just dumb luck. The year is 1077 BC, about a century after the worst of the collapse. Egypt is no longer the mighty empire that built the pyramids and conquered vast territories. It's a shrunken, impoverished version of itself, ruled by a tired old man, Ramses II, the last native Egyptian pharaoh to rule a united Egypt. Long gone are the days of god-kings beloved by the people, throwing lavish parties to celebrate victories in far-off lands. Instead, Egypt's economy has crashed. Basic goods cost a fortune. Taxes are crushing the population to maintain the army. People are so unhappy that the pharaohs wage war more often against their own citizens than foreign enemies. Egypt survived while others fell, but at what cost? The country essentially became a military dictatorship. Generals like Herihor rose through the ranks to control everything. The army, the government, and even religion as the high priest of Amun. Talk about a consolidation of power. One of Egypt's clever survival strategies was hiring their enemies as mercenaries. The very sea peoples who attacked them? Hired. Libyans from the west? Hired. It's like if someone breaks into your house and you say, "Hey, want a job protecting my house from other burglars?" Surprisingly, it worked. Kind of. Egypt's borders slowly shrank. Its wealth diminished. But it didn't completely collapse like the Hittites or Mycenaeans. The price was high, though. The pharaoh became little more than a figurehead. Real power lay with military strongmen like Herihor in the south and Smendes in the north. After Ramses XV died, the country formally split into two rival dynasties that engaged in a cold war for generations. It gets even darker. The economic strain was so severe that the state began officially looting ancient tombs. Imagine that. The government methodically stripping gold from royal mummies to fund its operations. Workers would carefully unwrap the ancient pharaohs, take anything valuable, then rewrap them in a semi-respectful manner. That's the ancient equivalent of melting down the Lincoln Memorial for spare change. The new pharaohs couldn't afford massive building projects like their predecessors. Instead, they maintained crumbling monuments, or, if they were particularly shameless, carved their names over old masterworks and pretended they had built them. This is what survival looked like in the Bronze Age collapse. A once mighty civilization reduced to cannibalizing its own past to survive the present. But Egypt was the exception, not the rule. And even Egypt's survival came with transformation so dramatic it barely resembled its former self. For most people in the Bronze Age world, survival meant something far different. And that's where our story gets really interesting. As you lie in your comfortable bed, safe from marauders and starvation, imagine what it would take to survive when everything familiar has been destroyed. Because that's exactly what our ancestors faced during history's first great collapse. And some of them, the ones you least expect, not only survived, but thrived in the new world that emerged from the ashes. Who are these unlikely survivors? That's where we'll pick up next as we follow the lives of those who made it through civilization's darkest hour. So we left off with Egypt, the exception that survived while everyone else fell apart. But their version of survival was pretty damn grim. Let's go deeper into what that actually looked like. Picture this. You're an ordinary Egyptian farmer in the Nile Delta around 1100 BC. The mighty civilization you once belonged to, the one that built the pyramids and conquered vast territories, now barely controls its own borders. Your grandparents told you stories about Egypt's golden age, but that world is gone. You wake up before dawn in your mud brick house. The air is thick and heavy with Nile moisture, but you're used to it. Outside, the fields need tending. Grain production is everything now. Not for trade or temples, but for the army. Always the damn army. They're taking half our harvest again, your neighbour mutters as you both head to the fields. At least last season it was only a third. Complain a little louder, you tell him. I hear the new general loves criticism. Gives you a free boat ride into the desert with no water. The neighbour goes quiet. Everyone knows someone who disappeared after speaking against the military government. The pharaoh in Memphis might technically be on the throne, but he's just a figurehead now. Real power lies with the military commanders who seized control during the collapse. Let me walk you through how this happened, because it's wild. When the Bronze Age system started falling apart around 1200 BC, Egypt actually fought off the initial waves of sea peoples and other invaders. The Egyptian reliefs at Medinet Habu show Pharaoh Ramesses III defeating these mysterious maritime raiders in a massive battle. We crushed the foreign lands in their places, the inscriptions boast. Their seed is no more. Spoiler alert, they didn't actually crush everyone. What they did was survive the first wave, but the cost was enormous and it fundamentally changed Egyptian society. Here's where it gets interesting. After fighting off these invaders, Egypt made a strategic decision that literally saved them while dooming their internal political system. They started hiring the very people who had attacked them. If you can't beat 'em, hire 'em became Egypt's motto. The Sea Peoples, hired as mercenaries. The Libyans from the west who had been raiding the Delta, hired en masse, wandering groups of warriors with nowhere to go. Welcome to the Egyptian army. Here's your payment. This strategy worked to keep Egypt from being overrun like the Hittites or Mycenaeans, but it transformed the country into a military state. The army became everything, and the people who commanded the army became the real rulers. One of these military men was Herihor, and his story is basically a masterclass in how to seize power during a crisis. This guy started as a regular military commander, but as Egypt weakened, he kept adding titles to his name. First, he became Supreme Commander of the Egyptian army. Not satisfied, he then became Grand Vizier of the South, basically Prime Minister. Still not enough, so he made himself Viceroy of Kush, controlling Egypt's southern territories, and then, to top it all off, High Priest of Amun at Thebes. Think about that for a second. This one dude controlled the military, the government, foreign territories, and religion. Talk about a power grab. But wasn't there a pharaoh, you ask? Technically, yes. Ramses X was still around, but he was old and weak. Herihor was smart enough not to declare himself pharaoh outright. Instead, he took on some pharaonic titles and imagery, while still acknowledging Ramses' authority, predominantly in name only, as one ancient text delicately puts it. If you walked into Herihor's throne room, you'd have seen him sitting there with all the symbols of pharaonic power, but technically calling himself something else. It's like if the chairman of the Joint Chiefs decided he was also Attorney General, Secretary of State, and Pope, but still said, "Oh yeah, the president is totally in charge," with a wink. I mean, the guy literally put his name in royal cartouches, those oval frames reserved for pharaohs' names. That's next level audacity. The worst part? Herihor wasn't the only one. In the Nile Delta, another strong man named Smendes was pulling the same stunt. Egypt effectively split in two, with military dictators controlling each half while pretending to respect the increasingly irrelevant pharaoh. Let's get back to you, that ordinary Egyptian farmer. What did all this mean for daily life? First, taxes went through the roof. The army had to be paid and they took whatever they needed. Papyri from this period show prices for basic goods skyrocketing. A measure of grain that cost 1 daben of copper before might now cost 5 or 10. Second, forced labour increased. Those massive building projects that Egypt was famous for, they mostly stopped, but maintaining existing structures, temples and irrigation still required workers. Guess who got dragged away from their fields to do that work? Third, personal freedom basically evaporated. The state needed control to survive, and that meant strict regulation of movement, trade and speech. You couldn't just pack up and leave if things got bad. Where would you go? Every neighbouring civilization had collapsed. My grandfather said he once travelled to Hatti for trade, an old potter tells you one evening. Can you imagine? Going to another country just to sell pots? You can't. The world beyond Egypt's borders is a mystery now, full of wandering tribes and burned cities. The international trade system that once connected the Bronze Age world is gone. But the most disturbing aspect of Egypt's survival strategy wasn't the military takeover or the economic disaster. It was what they did to their own heritage. After Ramses XIII died around 1077 BC, something unprecedented happened. His tomb, prepared throughout his lifetime as was Egyptian custom, was never used for his burial. Instead, it became a workshop for a state-sponsored grave-robbing operation. Yeah, you heard that right. The Egyptian government began systematically looting the tombs of their own ancestors. Workers would carefully unwrap ancient mummies, strip them of gold and jewels, occasionally scrape gold leaf off wooden coffins, then rewrap the bodies in a semi-respectful manner and return them to their tombs. A scribe named Herihor, not to be confused with Herihor, left records of this process, clinical and methodical. The gold of Sethos's mask weighed 6 deben, he wrote. The amulets from the inner wrappings, 12 deben and 3 kite. Imagine the cultural equivalent today, like the British government melting down the crown jewels to pay bills, or the United States selling the Liberty Bell for scrap metal. It's not disrespect, a temple official explains when you look horrified at the news. The ancestors would want to support Egypt in its time of need. You're not convinced, but what can you do? The temples have the maps to all the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. The priests work with the military now. This is the new normal. The Egypt that emerged from the Bronze Age collapse was a shadow of its former self, but it was still standing. Their survival strategy, militarization, territory consolidation, resource extraction at any cost, worked in the most basic sense. They didn't completely disappear like the Hittites. But let's be clear about something. Surviving isn't the same as thriving. Egypt limped on for centuries, becoming increasingly isolated and inward-looking. The two rival dynasties that formed after Ramses XIII's death engaged in a cold war with each other rather than rebuilding international connections. The pharaohs of these new dynasties couldn't afford massive building projects like their predecessors. They maintained crumbling monuments when they could afford it, or if they were particularly shameless, carved their names over ancient masterworks and pretended they had built them themselves. I passed the great temple at Karnak yesterday, a travelling merchant tells you. The new pharaoh has scratched out 3 old names and put his own in their place. The paint is still wet. Egypt's story is basically what happens when survival becomes the only goal. They sacrificed everything, their political system, their economy, their cultural heritage, just to keep existing. Was it worth it? That's not for me to say, but it certainly wasn't pretty. There's one more aspect of Egypt's survival that deserves mention: geography. The Nile was Egypt's greatest asset. While other regions relied on rainfall agriculture that could fail during droughts, which some evidence suggests contributed to the Bronze Age collapse, Egypt's farming depended on the annual Nile flood. As long as that cycle continued, Egypt could feed itself, even if international trade collapsed. The desert barriers on either side of the Nile Valley also provided some protection against invaders who had to cross harsh terrain to reach the population centres. But not everyone who survived the Bronze Age collapse did so by hunkering down behind natural barriers and turning into a military state. Some took the exact opposite approach. While Egypt was building walls and consolidating power, other survivors were constantly on the move, adapting to the new, chaotic world in very different ways. Remember that Egyptian farmer we've been following? One evening he sees something unusual on the horizon, a dust cloud moving along the desert edge. Through the haze, dark figures appear, men on donkeys leading herds of sheep and goats. They're not Egyptians. Their clothes are different, their language strange. Mountain people, an old soldier spits, coming down to trade wool and cheese for grain. They're the ones who destroyed the Hittites, you know, sacked their capital at Hattusha. Now they wander with their flocks, answering to no king. The farmer watches, fascinated. These people look poor compared to Egyptians, their clothes rougher, their possessions few. But there's something in their bearing, a kind of freedom that Egyptians haven't known since before the collapse. Do they ever worry about taxes, the farmer asks. The soldier laughs. Who would collect them? They move with the seasons. No palaces, no temples, no grand cities to maintain, just families and their animals. The farmer considers this as the strangers approach the village market. He's never left Egypt, never considered any other way of life, but as he watches these nomads, survivors of a different sort, he wonders for the first time if there might be other ways to live in this broken world. And that's where we turn our attention next, to the mountain peoples who came down from their highland fortresses to take advantage of the chaos in the flatlands. Because while Egypt was desperately trying to maintain a version of the old order, these folks were creating something entirely new from the ruins. The mountain warriors were coming down from their high places, and the world would never be the same. While Egypt was turning itself into a military dictatorship just to survive, a very different kind of survival story was playing out to the north. This one's about revenge, opportunity, and people who'd been waiting generations to turn the tables. Picture this. You're born in the mountains of Anatolia, what's now Turkey. But you're not part of the mighty Hittite empire that controls the fertile plateaus and valleys. You're a Kaska tribesperson, living in the harsh northern highlands where the soil is thin and the winters brutal. For generations, your people have been pushed around by the Hittites. Sometimes you're their vassals paying tribute. Sometimes you're officially at war. Sometimes there's an uneasy peace. But always, always, you're looking down from your mountain villages at the rich Hittite lands below, wondering why they get to have it so good while you scrape by. The sun isn't even up yet. Frost coats the ground outside your stone hut. Your breath forms clouds in the cold morning air as you check your weapons one last time. Today isn't a raid, the kind your people have conducted for centuries, darting down from the mountains to steal cattle or grain before retreating to safety. No, today is different. The flatland cities are falling everywhere, your tribal chief says, his voice low and intense. The Hittite king has pulled soldiers from our borders to defend against sea raiders on the coast. Their god king sits in Hattusha with half his usual protection. He pauses, letting this sink in. Around you, dozens of warriors nod grimly. Everyone knows what this means. How many generations have the Hittites taken our best land? How many of our children have starved during harsh winters while they feast in their palaces? The gods have given us this moment. We would be fools not to take it. That night you join thousands of Casca warriors descending from the mountains. Not just your tribe, but a coalition of mountain peoples with old grudges against the Hittites. You're not alone either. All across the Bronze Age world, mountain peoples are making the same calculation. Okay, wait, I can hear you thinking from the comfort of your bed. Who exactly were these mountain people? Great question. The mountains surrounding the fertile valleys and plateaus of the Near East were home to dozens of different groups. The Casca in northern Anatolia, the Mushki to the northeast, the various peoples of the Caucasus Mountains, the Gutians and Elamites in the Zagros Mountains east of Mesopotamia. For centuries, these mountain folks had a particular relationship with the flatland kingdoms like the Hittites, Assyrians, and Babylonians. When the big empires were strong and united, they'd march armies into the mountains and force the people there to pay tribute, basically saying, "Give us your valuable metal ores, timber, and whatever else we want, or we'll burn your villages." But when those empires weakened, during civil wars, succession crises, or natural disasters, the mountain peoples would pour down into the flatlands, raiding, collecting their own tribute, and sometimes sacking cities. It was this constant back and forth, with the balance of power shifting depending on who was stronger at any given moment. What made the Bronze Age collapse different was that it wasn't just one empire having a bad decade. It was the entire system falling apart simultaneously. And for the mountain peoples, this wasn't just an opportunity to raid, it was a chance to permanently change the power dynamic. Back to our Casca warrior. You're approaching Hattusha, the mighty capital of the Hittite Empire. In its prime, this was one of the most impressive cities in the world, with massive stone walls, grand temples, and a royal acropolis. The Hittite kings ruled from here over an empire that stretched from western Anatolia to northern Syria. But now, as you and your fellow warriors creep closer under cover of darkness, the city seems diminished somehow. Parts of the wall are unmanned. There are fewer lights than there should be for a city this size. "They've sent too many soldiers elsewhere," your chief whispers, "and many have deserted. The city folk are hungry. Their trade routes for grain have been disrupted." You'd always imagined that taking Hattusha would be impossible, that its walls would be too high, its soldiers too many. Yet here you are, about to attempt exactly that. What happens next is exactly what archaeologists discovered when they excavated Hattusha. The city was utterly sacked. The royal palace and temples burned, skeletons in the streets, the entire mighty capital of the Hittite Empire wiped off the map so completely that the very location of Hattusha was forgotten until archaeologists rediscovered it in modern times. The Hittite Empire, which had stood for over 600 years and once fought Egypt to a standstill, was gone in what seems to have been a matter of days or weeks. But the Kaskas weren't the only mountain people taking advantage of the chaos. Far to the east, another highland group was making their move against an even more ancient centre of civilization, Babylon, that legendary city, the intellectual and cultural heart of Mesopotamia for over 1,000 years, the city of Hammurabi's code, of the hanging gardens, of ziggurats reaching to the heavens. After surviving an attack by the Assyrian king Tukulti-Ninurta there, the city was struggling to recover when disaster struck again. This time it was the Elamites, a powerful and highly organized mountain kingdom from what's now southwestern Iran. The Elamites had a long, complicated history with Mesopotamian powers, alternating between being trading partners, military rivals, and outright enemies. When they saw Babylon weakened, they made their move. Under their king Shutruk-Nahunte, try saying that 5 times fast, the Elamites sacked Babylon around 1155 BC, plundering its temples and palaces, and carrying off treasures like the famous stele bearing Hammurabi's code. "We found their king hiding in a temple," an Elamite soldier might have told his children years later. "He begged for mercy in the name of his gods. Our king asked him where those gods were now." The destruction was catastrophic. Archaeological evidence shows widespread burning and abandonment. Southern Mesopotamia, the very cradle of civilization, plunged into a centuries-long dark age. Now here's where it gets really interesting. In many cases, these mountain peoples didn't just raid and leave. Some of them stayed, establishing themselves as the new ruling class in the territories they conquered. This wasn't a new pattern. Earlier in Mesopotamian history, groups like the Hurrians, Gutians, and Kassites had done the same thing, coming down from the mountains, conquering flatland kingdoms, and then gradually adopting much of the local culture while maintaining power. For the people living through the Bronze Age collapse, this transition could be surprisingly swift. 1 month, you're a farmer paying taxes to a Hittite official. The next, you're paying taxes to a Kaska chieftain who's moved into the local governor's palace. The new lord doesn't speak our language properly, a town baker might gossip to customers, but he demands less grain than the old one, and his warriors keep away the bandits, so who's complaining? For many ordinary people, life under new mountain overlords might actually have been an improvement. The complex, top-heavy bureaucracies of the Bronze Age kingdoms extracted enormous resources to maintain palaces, temples, and armies. Mountain tribal leaders often had simpler needs, at least initially. Of course, it wasn't all smooth transitions and reasonable new overlords. In many places, the incoming mountain peoples were brutal conquerors. They hadn't forgotten generations of exploitation by the flatland kingdoms. A merchant fleeing the destruction of a Hittite provincial city described the scene. They killed everyone who couldn't run. Then they burned everything. They said it was justice for what the Hittite kings had done to their ancestors. This brings up an important point about survival during the Bronze Age collapse. Sometimes, the difference between surviving and not surviving wasn't about your personal skills or resources. It was simply about where you happened to be when disaster struck. If you were in Hattusha when the Kaskas came, your chances were pretty bad regardless of who you were. If you were in a small village that peacefully submitted to new rulers, you might have carried on much as before, just paying tribute to different collectors. For the mountain peoples themselves, the collapse presented a once-in-a-millennium opportunity. Suddenly, all those rich flatlands with their fertile soil and established cities were theirs for the taking. After generations of being the underdogs, they were now on top. But their success wasn't just about taking advantage of a power vacuum. These mountain folks had developed specific skills and cultural adaptations that served them incredibly well in a collapsing world. First, they were used to harsh conditions. When you grow up in mountainous terrain with thin soil and cold winters, you learn to be tough. Food scarcity, something new and terrifying for city dwellers, was a fact of life that mountain people had strategies to manage. Second, their social structures were more flexible. While the great Bronze Age kingdoms had elaborate bureaucracies that collapsed when their palaces burned, mountain tribes operated on kinship networks and direct leadership. A tribal chief didn't need a staff of scribes and a palace complex to give orders. Third, they were mobile. Mountain peoples were accustomed to moving with the seasons, following herds, or relocating when necessary. When disaster struck, they could pick up and go elsewhere much more easily than settled farmers or city dwellers. An old Hittite, scribe captured during the sack of Hattusha, marveled at his new reality. These people have no permanent temples for their gods. They carry their sacred objects with them. They can worship anywhere. Perhaps this is why their gods seem stronger than ours now. They are not trapped in burning buildings. This mobility factor is critical to understanding who survived the Bronze Age collapse. The mountain peoples have been practicing a mixed subsistence strategy for centuries, some farming in the summer months combined with herding, hunting, and gathering. This made them far more adaptable when stable agriculture systems broke down. But the mountain peoples weren't the only ones with this advantage. There was another group, even more mobile, even more adaptable, that would prove to be the ultimate survivors of the Bronze Age collapse. While you're lying in your comfortable bed, warm and secure, imagine what it would be like to have no permanent home at all. No fields to tie you down, no city walls to trap you, just your family, your animals, and the open horizon. Because that's how the next group of survivors lived, and it turned out to be their greatest strength when the world fell apart. The mountain peoples had their revenge on the great empires, but even their victory was temporary. Some settled into their conquered territories and gradually took on the trappings of the civilizations they'd destroyed. Others maintained their mountain identities but formed new relationships with the emerging powers of the Iron Age. In the Levant, some former Hittite territories survived as a collection of small Neo-Hittite states, maintaining cultural continuity while adapting to the new reality. Archaeological evidence shows these communities preserved Hittite artistic styles and religious practices for centuries after the empire's fall. My grandmother's grandmother served in the great temple at Hattusha. A priestess in a small Neo-Hittite city-state might tell her apprentice, "We keep the old rituals alive, even if our kingdom is smaller now." But while some clung to the remnants of Bronze Age glory, others embraced a completely different way of life, one that would prove remarkably successful in the new, dangerous world. As the dust settled over the ruins of once great cities, a different kind of survivor was already thriving in the spaces between. These weren't mountain warriors or desperate city dwellers. They were people who had always lived on the margins of the Bronze Age world and suddenly found themselves perfectly adapted for the new reality. The pastoralist nomads were coming, and unlike the mountain peoples who conquered and settled, These folks would transform the entire social landscape of the Near East through sheer, unstoppable mobility. The mountain warriors had their moment, swooping down to sack great cities and settle in conquered territories. But they weren't the greatest survivors of the Bronze Age. Collapse, not even close. That title belongs to people who, before the collapse, were considered barely worth mentioning in the records of great kingdoms. People who lived on the margins, in the spaces between cities and fields. People who owned almost nothing, yet ended up inheriting everything. I'm talking about the pastoral nomads. Imagine this. The year is 1150 BC. You're part of a small clan of sheep herders living on the southern edges of the Fertile Crescent. Your entire life fits on the backs of a few donkeys, tents, cooking pots, some spare clothes, tools for working wool and leather. Your people don't build permanent houses. You don't plant crops. You follow the seasonal rains with your flocks, moving between winter and summer pastures. When water sources dry up, you move. When grazing land is depleted, you move. If stronger tribes threaten your clan, guess what? You move again. This morning you wake before dawn in your goat hair tent. The air is cool, crisp with autumn. Your muscles ache from yesterday's long walk, but that's normal. Your whole life is walking. The sheep need to be moved to fresh grazing every day. Trouble to the north, your cousin says, squatting beside the small fire where you're brewing a bitter herbal tea. Smoke on the horizon, another city burning. You glance up, unconcerned. Cities have been burning for decades now. The great kingdoms that once dominated the landscape are tearing each other apart or being torn apart by invaders. It has little to do with your daily life of moving sheep from one patch of grass to another, or does it? Your clan elder joins you at the fire. She's seen more years than anyone else in your group. Maybe 50, an impressive age in this harsh world. We should head south and east, she says, warming her gnarled hands over the flames. The big empires are gone. Their armies aren't patrolling the good pastures anymore. The farmers who used to chase us away from their fields, most are dead or fled. It's all open to us now. The elder sips her tea, a faint smile crossing her weathered face. My grandmother told me of a time when our people controlled all the lands from the great river to the salt sea, before the kings with their chariots and walls pushed us to the margins. Perhaps that time is coming again. This conversation, or ones very like it, must have happened countless times as pastoral nomadic groups across the Near East realized what the collapse of centralized powers meant for them. Suddenly, lands that had been densely populated, carefully controlled and vigorously defended were empty, or nearly so. In the most fertile regions of Mesopotamia, Iraq today, complex irrigation systems had allowed for some of the highest population densities in the ancient world. But those systems required constant maintenance by organized labor forces directed by central authorities. When those authorities collapsed, the canals silted up, fields went unplanted, and vast areas of once productive farmland were abandoned. Hold up, I hear you thinking. Who exactly were these nomads? Where did they come from? Great question. The most successful of them in this period were groups like the Arameans, Sutians and Chaldeans. They'd been living on the southern and western periphery of the Fertile Crescent for generations, moving with their flocks between seasonal pastures. Before the collapse, these pastoralists were mentioned in the records of major kingdoms mainly as nuisances, raiders who occasionally had to be put in their place by royal armies. Sometimes they were hired as mercenaries or guides for caravans crossing difficult terrain, but they were never considered serious political players. That was about to change dramatically. Let's focus on the Arameans, since they became particularly successful. Their homeland, if nomads can be said to have one, was in the Syrian desert and the regions around Damascus. But as the Bronze Age system collapsed, they began migrating into Mesopotamia in large numbers. The countryside they entered was devastated by war, famine, and abandonment. But for pastoralists, this wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Land that couldn't support dense farming populations could still sustain scattered groups of sheep and goat herders. As one Assyrian official complained in a letter to his king, "Where once 1,000 farmers tilled the soil, now 50 Arameans graze their flocks. The tax revenue is 1/10 what it was, and they refuse to acknowledge royal authority, moving their tents whenever our soldiers approach." For the Arameans, the collapse didn't feel like a collapse at all. It felt like opportunity. Your clan has been travelling for weeks, moving deeper into territories that once belonged to the Assyrian Empire. The journey hasn't been easy. Water sources are sometimes contaminated by decomposing bodies, and occasionally you encounter desperate refugees or bandits. But mostly you find empty land. Villages with abandoned houses, their roofs caved in, fields returning to wilderness, and everywhere, wild grasses growing where wheat and barley were once carefully cultivated. "More grass than the sheep can eat," your brother says, watching the flock spread out across a hillside that shows the faint traces of old terracing, and no farmers to chase us away. That night your clan makes camp in the shell of what was once a prosperous farmstead. The stone walls still stand, though the wooden roof is long gone. In the courtyard, someone has scratched a message into the plaster. "Balita Dad went north with the children. If you follow, leave a sign." You wonder what happened to Balita Dad and his family. Did they find safety? Did they reach their destination? Or did they join the countless others who didn't survive the collapse? It's strange to think that your people, always the outsiders, the unwanted, the barely tolerated, are thriving while the great civilizations crumble. But your way of life prepared you for this moment in ways you're only beginning to understand. For starters, you're mobile. When danger threatens, you don't need to defend walls or fields, you just move. Your wealth isn't in buildings or heavy possessions that can't be transported. It's in your animals, which transport themselves. You're also self-sufficient. Your clan produces almost everything it needs: meat and milk from the herds, wool and hides for clothing and tents. The few things you can't make, metal tools, certain luxury goods, you can trade for, offering cheese, wool, or young animals. And perhaps most importantly, your social structure is resilient. It's based on kinship and direct relationships, not on complex bureaucracies that can collapse when a palace burns. If half your clan died tomorrow, a horrifying thought, the other half would continue functioning with the same social organisation, just on a smaller scale. These advantages meant that while settled populations were devastated by the Bronze Age collapse, pastoral nomads like the Arameans actually expanded their territory and influence dramatically. "We found an old temple yesterday," your cousin tells you as you walk behind the sheep. "Statues of foreign gods knocked over, offerings scattered, but in one corner, untouched, a small shrine to the storm god." You nod, unsurprised. The storm god is revered by your people too, though you don't build grand temples for him. The god travels with you, present in the thunder and life-giving rain. Perhaps that's why he survived when other gods, trapped in their stone houses, were overthrown. The Arameans weren't just taking advantage of newly available grazing land. Some groups began settling in abandoned villages and towns, creating new power centres. Others took control of strategic locations like water sources or trade crossroads, extracting payments from anyone wanting to pass. As their numbers and confidence grew, they became bolder. Assyrian records, admittedly not the most objective source, describe Aramean bands raiding farms, attacking caravans, and even assaulting small cities. The mighty Assyrian Empire, which had survived the initial shock of the Bronze Age collapse better than most, found itself increasingly beset by these highly mobile adversaries. Assyrian kings launched campaign after campaign against the Arameans, each time claiming total victory. "We have utterly destroyed the Aramean menace," one royal inscription boasts. "Their settlements are burned, their flocks scattered, their fighting men slain. They will trouble Assyria no more." And yet, a few years later, the same king, or his successor, would again campaign against these supposedly defeated enemies. This pattern repeated for decades. I love this part because it shows how traditional military powers struggled against asymmetric threats like the Arameans. The Assyrian army was a fearsome war machine, well equipped and disciplined. But how do you defeat an enemy who simply packs up and moves when you approach, only to return after you leave? The evidence suggests the Assyrians frequently lost these conflicts, though they weren't keen on recording their defeats. 3 signs point to this. First, the sheer number of campaigns they launched against the Arameans. If they'd actually won, they wouldn't have needed to keep fighting the same enemy. Second, they made and kept peace with the survivors of their old enemy Babylon, who was also being overrun by nomadic pastoralists. And third, they ultimately abandoned their empire and retreated to their heartland, which itself came under Aramean assault. "They're impossible to pin down," an Assyrian general might have complained. "We march forth with our chariots and infantry in formation, and they simply melt away into the landscape. Then they return at night in small bands, attacking our supply lines and isolated outposts." The situation grew so dire that even Assyria's impressive infrastructure began to fail. Archaeological evidence shows that an aqueduct supplying their capital city was destroyed during this period and remained unrepaired for decades, something unthinkable in Assyria's prime. Some particularly daring Aramean leaders captured remote Assyrian mountain forts, using them as bases for further operations. And as refugees fled the countryside for the safety of walled cities, these urban centres faced food shortages, disease outbreaks, and civil unrest. Basically, the most powerful surviving empire of the Bronze Age was being taken apart piece by sheep herders. "Never underestimate sheep herders," my archaeology professor once told me. "They've outlasted every empire in history. Your clan has joined with several others, forming a larger tribal group for protection and to control a valuable water source. Your camp has grown to nearly 100 tents, with thousands of sheep and goats grazing the surrounding hills." One morning, a group of strangers approaches, farmers by their clothing, though their garments are torn and dirty from long travel. "Our village was raided," their leader explains, a gaunt man with haunted eyes. "First by soldiers demanding grain for the king's army, then by bandits taking what the soldiers left. We have nowhere to go. Your tribal chief considers them. More mouths to feed, but also more hands to work. Can any of you herd animals, or work wool, or tan hides?" The farmers look at each other uncertainly. "We can learn," their leader says. The chief nods. "Then you can stay. Each family will be assigned to a clan. You'll work for them, learn our ways. In 3 summers, if you've proven yourselves, you can have your own flocks. This scene played out countless times during and after the Bronze Age collapse. As traditional farming communities became unviable, many survivors joined nomadic groups, gradually adopting their lifestyle and culture. It wasn't always a peaceful integration. Many farmers were simply enslaved by Aramean bands. An Assyrian text describes numerous small bands of Arameans stalking the countryside, enslaving rural farmers. This forced rural populations to flee to walled cities for protection, further disrupting agriculture and creating new problems of overcrowding and resource scarcity. But over time, something remarkable happened. Many Aramean groups, having seized territory and resources, began transitioning from pure nomadism to a more settled existence. Some became rulers of small kingdoms centered on fortified towns, often built on the ruins of Bronze Age settlements. My grandfather herded sheep in the desert. An Aramean king might tell visitors to his modest palace. My father took control of this town and the surrounding lands, and now I rule as a king, with walls to protect my people and fields to feed them. This transition from nomadic pastoralist to settled ruler wasn't unique to the Arameans or to this period. It's a pattern we see throughout history, from the Amorites in earlier Mesopotamian history, to the Germanic tribes in the late Roman Empire, to the Seljuk Turks in medieval Anatolia. But what makes the post-Bronze Age example so significant is the scale. Pastoral nomadism became the dominant lifestyle throughout much of the Near East for generations, and when new states eventually formed, many were ruled by dynasties of nomadic origin. The Arameans were particularly successful. While they never united into a single empire, their independent streak and competitive nature prevented that. They established numerous kingdoms and city-states. The most powerful and long-lasting was Aram Damascus, which became a major regional power. From this base, Aramean rulers launched military campaigns against other emerging states, including the Hebrew tribes to the south. The Bible records numerous conflicts between the Kingdom of Israel and the Arameans of Damascus, showing how these former nomads had become a formidable settled power. Even more remarkably, the Aramean language, Aramaic, became the international language of diplomacy and trade throughout the Near East, replacing Akkadian, which had held that position during the Bronze Age. For over 1,000 years, Aramaic served as a lingua franca across a vast region. Jesus himself would later speak Aramaic as his primary language. Not bad for a group that started out as marginalized sheep herders on the edges of civilization. As you drift off to sleep tonight in your comfortable bed, think about those nomadic pastoralists who found opportunity in catastrophe. While kings and scribes and city dwellers saw their world ending, the Arameans and their kind were just beginning their rise to prominence. Their society, mobile, adaptable, resilient, turned out to be perfectly suited for a time when mighty empires fell like dominoes. But they weren't the only unlikely survivors of the Bronze Age collapse. Even as pastoral nomads thrived in the devastated countryside, another group was finding ways to navigate the chaos, connecting the fragments of the shattered world. These were people who, like the nomads, had always lived somewhat outside the structures of palace and temple. People who spoke many languages, knew many customs, and could move between different societies with ease. The merchants were about to have their moment, and their story of survival is just as fascinating as that of the nomads who transformed the Near East. While pastoral nomads were thriving in the devastated countryside, there was another group finding their own path through the chaos. These were people who, even before everything fell apart, lived their lives crossing borders and navigating between different cultures. I'm talking about merchants, the Bronze Age equivalent of international business people. Picture yourself as a merchant from the coastal city of Ugarit, in what's now Syria. Before the collapse, you made a good living trading luxury goods between Egypt, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the Aegean. You speak 5 languages. You know the customs of a dozen kingdoms. You've paid bribes to officials from Mycenae to Memphis. When the collapse began, you saw it coming before most people. Trade routes were disrupted. Certain goods became impossible to find. Piracy increased along the coast. The price of everyday items started fluctuating wildly. One evening, you're sitting in a tavern near the Ugarit harbour. The clay tablet in front of you contains bad news. The latest message from your trading partner in Hattusa reports the Hittite capital is under threat from mountain tribes. This is the 3rd major trade hub to send warnings in as many months. "Smart money's moving east," says an Egyptian merchant sliding onto the bench across from you. You've done business with him before. He specializes in luxury goods for the Egyptian elite, or as far away from here as possible. You take a sip of your beer. Nowhere's safe from what I hear. Mycenae's burning. Hattusa's threatened. Egypt's barely holding on. The Egyptian nods grimly. The sea routes are crawling with pirates too, but sitting still seems like the worst option. He gestures around the tavern, where local officials are trying to requisition goods for the city's defence. Ugarit's walls won't hold if the wrong people come knocking. He was right. Archaeological evidence shows Ugarit was violently destroyed around 1185 BC. Arrowheads found embedded in buildings and human remains in the streets suggest a sudden, catastrophic attack that the city's defences couldn't withstand. A clay tablet discovered in the ruins contains a desperate plea for help from the king. "Enemy ships came, my cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country." But while many of Ugarit's residents perished, evidence suggests some merchants saw the writing on the wall and got out before the final destruction. And those merchants, with their unique skills and connections, were remarkably well positioned to survive the Bronze Age collapse. Think about it. While farmers were tied to their land and city dwellers were trapped within their walls, merchants were already mobile by nature. They owned ships and donkeys and wagons. They had contacts in distant cities. They carried wealth in portable forms like silver or precious stones rather than land or buildings. No wonder the merchants were better at not dying, my archaeology professor used to say. Their whole existence was about calculating risks and finding opportunities. Let's follow our merchant from Ugarit as he makes his escape. The night after that conversation in the tavern, he loads his most valuable and portable goods onto 3 donkeys. Gold and silver, yes, but also practical items. Good tools, preserved food, medicine, quality clothing. And most importantly, his collection of clay tablets containing records of debts owed to him in distant cities and letters of introduction to potential business partners. He slips out of Ugarit before dawn with his teenage son and a hired guard. His wife and daughters left weeks earlier for her family's village in the mountains, a safer location than the coastal city. "Where are we going, father?" his son asks as they follow the coast road eastward. "Where the trouble isn't," he answers, "and where we can still make a living." This ability to go where the trouble isn't gave merchants a survival edge that most people lacked. When your entire business model involves travelling between different regions, you develop an acute sense of where danger lies and which routes to avoid. Merchants also had another crucial advantage: information. In a world without newspapers or the internet, merchants were often the primary sources of news from distant places. They knew before most people which regions were stable, which were dangerous, and which were on the brink of collapse. Mycenae has fallen, a merchant might report to a gathering in a market town. The palace was looted and burned. The king is dead, but the port at Pylos is still operating, though they're charging triple the usual fees for protection. This kind of intelligence was literally life-saving during the Bronze Age collapse. While ordinary people might hear vague rumours about trouble, merchants often had specific, actionable information about which routes were safe, which cities still had food, and which rulers could still provide protection. Our Ugarit merchant travels for weeks, carefully skirting areas of known danger. He trades small items in villages along the way, a bronze needle here, a vial of Egyptian perfume there, both to supplement his supplies and to gather fresh information. He eventually reaches the Assyrian heartland, one of the few regions still maintaining some stability. The Assyrian kings, through sheer military might, have managed to hold off the worst of the collapse, though their territories have shrunk considerably. In the Assyrian capital, he finds a strange scene. The city is clearly under stress. Refugees crowd the streets, food is expensive, and military patrols are everywhere. But in the midst of this, the king, Ashur-bel-kala, has embarked on an unusual project, a collection of exotic animals from distant lands, the world's first known zoo. The king requires specimens for his animal garden, a royal official tells our merchant. He pays well for creatures never before seen in Assyria. Now here's the absolutely wild thing. This actually happened. In the midst of the Bronze Age collapse, with his empire fighting for survival against Aramean incursions and internal unrest, the Assyrian king Ashur-bel-kala really did create a zoo with exotic animals. An inscription from his reign boasts, "I received a female ape as tribute from the land of Muzri. I bred herds of apes and elephants. I received a crocodile, a river man from the king of Egypt." On the surface, this seems like insane misplacement of priorities. Your empire is crumbling and you're collecting zoo animals. But from a certain perspective, it makes a weird kind of sense. The zoo demonstrated that Assyria still had international connections when most other kingdoms had become isolated. It was a power move. Look, I can still get luxury goods from Egypt when no one else can. For merchants, the royal zoo represented a rare opportunity in desperate times. Suddenly there was a buyer willing to pay premium prices for exotic goods, at a time when the market for most luxury items had collapsed along with the elites who used to purchase them. Our merchant from Ugarit hears rumours that traders who brought unusual animals to the Assyrian king have been richly rewarded. With his knowledge of distant lands and trading routes, he believes he can procure something that will impress the king. "We'll go south," he tells his son, "to the marshes where the two rivers meet the sea. There are creatures there found nowhere else. The journey is perilous. The countryside is plagued by bandits and desperate refugees. Twice they have to bribe their way through checkpoints set up by Aramean tribes who now control stretches of what was once imperial territory. Once they have to abandon the road entirely and travel cross-country to avoid a battle between Assyrian forces and local insurgents. But the merchant's knowledge of languages and cultures saves them repeatedly. When confronted by a band of Aramean shepherds turned warriors, he speaks their dialect and invokes the name of their tribal deity. When stopped at an Assyrian military checkpoint, he produces a clay tablet with an official seal from a previous trading venture. This cultural fluency was perhaps the merchant's greatest survival asset. While others might view strangers with suspicion or hostility, merchants had always made their living by connecting with people from different backgrounds. "I've been arrested in 7 kingdoms," an old spice trader boasts to younger merchants at a caravanserai, "and talked my way out of execution in 6 of them. The trick is to find what the local strongman wants most and convince him you're the only one who can provide it." After weeks of difficult travel, our merchant reaches the southern marshes. With the help of local fishermen and a significant amount of silver, he captures several unusual creatures, including a young crocodile. Transporting this dangerous animal back to the Assyrian capital is a logistical nightmare involving a wooden cage, constant vigilance, and regular feedings of fish and meat. "This is madness," his son complains as the crocodile snaps at him during a feeding. "We could have traded for grain or textiles or anything normal people want." "Normal trade goods mean normal profits," the merchant replies. "This beast will buy us a house in the capital and the king's protection." He's right. When they finally reach the Assyrian capital and present the crocodile to Ashur-bel-kala, the king is delighted with this river dragon from the south. He rewards the merchant generously with silver, a small house near the market district, and most valuably, a tablet bearing the royal seal that grants him certain trading privileges. While this specific story is fictional, the broader pattern it represents is supported by archaeological evidence. Merchants were among the most successful survivors of the Bronze Age collapse, using their mobility, connections, and cultural knowledge to navigate the chaos. Some, like our fictional Ugarit trader, found refuge in the few remaining stable kingdoms like Assyria. Others established new trading networks that connected the fragmented post-collapse world, helping to eventually rebuild economic links between regions. One fascinating archaeological discovery supporting this comes from the island of Cyprus. During the worst of the Bronze Age collapse, most international trade had ground to a halt, but at several Cypriot sites, archaeologists have found ceramic vessels from widely scattered locations: Egypt, Canaan, Greece, and Anatolia, all dating to this period of supposed isolation. The presence of these traded goods suggests that some merchants found ways to maintain at least limited trading networks, even at the height of the collapse. They might have used smaller vessels, travelled with armed guards, stuck to safer coastal routes, or developed new strategies to reduce risk. "Never underestimate the human drive to buy and sell stuff," my economics professor used to say. Merchants will find a way to trade through almost anything: wars, plagues, collapsing civilizations. Where there's demand and potential profit, someone will figure out how to supply the goods. Another key to merchant survival was adaptability, the willingness to trade in whatever goods were in demand. Before the collapse, many specialized in luxury items for elites: fine textiles, precious metals, exotic woods, rare spices. When those markets disappeared along with the palaces that consumed such goods, successful merchants pivoted to more practical commodities. "My grandfather traded perfumes for the ladies of the Hittite court," a merchant might tell his apprentice. "My father traded bronze weapons during the wars of collapse. I trade iron tools for farmers rebuilding their fields." Each generation adapts to what the world needs. This adaptability extended to routes and methods as well. When major highways became dangerous due to bandits or warfare, merchants pioneered alternative paths through mountains or deserts. When sea routes were threatened by the mysterious sea peoples, they developed land caravans with better protection. Your eyes are getting heavy as you listen to the story, your bed soft and warm around you. Unlike the merchants of the Bronze Age, you don't need to worry about finding safe routes through chaotic lands or negotiating with warlords for passage. Your most difficult journey tomorrow might be a commute to work or school, not exactly comparable to transporting a crocodile hundreds of miles through bandit-infested territory. But there's something universal in these ancient survival stories. The merchants who survived and even thrived during the Bronze Age collapse weren't necessarily the physically strongest or the wealthiest. They were the most informed, the most connected, and above all, the most adaptable. They recognized reality quickly when things started falling apart. They didn't cling to the old ways when those ways no longer worked. They assessed the changing world accurately and adjusted their strategies accordingly. One of the most striking examples of merchant survival and adaptation comes from the aftermath of the collapse. As the dust settled on the ruins of Bronze Age civilization, it was often merchants who helped establish new centers of commerce and culture in places that had previously been backwaters. The Phoenician city-states along the coast of modern Lebanon, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, had been modest trading centers during the Bronze Age, overshadowed by greater powers like Egypt and the Hittites. After the collapse, when those major powers were gone or greatly diminished, Phoenician merchant princes filled the vacuum. They created new trading networks throughout the Mediterranean, established colonies as far west as Spain, and developed the alphabetic writing system that eventually evolved into the one we use today. Not bad for collapse survivors, but while the merchants found their unique path through the chaos by staying mobile and connected, another group of survivors took the opposite approach. They found safety not through movement, but by creating defensible communities in remote locations where they could ride out the storm together. And as you lie there drifting towards sleep, we'll turn to these communities next. The small kingdoms that emerged from the ruins, where shepherds became kings and new ways of life took root in the ashes of the old world. While Egypt limped on as a military dictatorship, and merchants navigated the chaos with their connections and mobility, something remarkable was happening in the ruins of collapsed civilizations. New kingdoms were emerging, not grand empires like before, but smaller, scrappier states built on the ashes of what came before. And the strangest part? Many of these new kingdoms were being ruled by people who, just a generation earlier, had been illiterate shepherds living in tents. Imagine a small walled town somewhere in what's now northern Syria, around 1050 BC. 100 years earlier, this was a provincial centre in the mighty Hittite Empire. The governor's palace stood in the centre, surrounded by temples, workshops, and homes of the wealthy. Beyond the walls, farmers worked fields that fed the urban population. Then came the collapse. The Hittite Empire disintegrated. The governor fled or was killed. The town was attacked repeatedly, first by organised armies, then by desperate refugees, finally by bands of nomadic raiders. Many buildings burned, many people died. The survivors huddled behind walls that were increasingly difficult to maintain. Now, a century later, life goes on, but very differently. The governor's palace has been rebuilt, though on a much smaller scale. Instead of Hittite officials in chariots, men in the simple garb of Aramean tribal leaders stride through the streets. In the central square, an old man sits with his grandchildren telling stories of the old days. "When I was a boy," he says, This town belonged to the great king of Hattusa. His word was law from the sunrise sea to the sunset sea. The children look skeptical. They've never known any ruler except the local Aramean chief who now calls himself king. The very name Hattusa means nothing to them. "How did our king come to rule here, grandfather?" one child asks. The old man sighs. "That's a complicated story. When the old empire fell and chaos was everywhere, Aramean tribes raided us season after season. They would come with their warriors, take our food and valuables, then disappear before the few soldiers we had could respond." He shifts on his bench, rubbing his arthritic knee. One particular chief was especially persistent. Every harvest, like clockwork, he and his men would appear. Eventually, our town council had a radical idea. They invited him to a meeting and said, "Instead of raiding us year after year, why not come live here and be our king? You can collect regular tribute, and in return you protect us from other raiders." The children's eyes widen. "And he agreed?" "Of course he did," the grandfather chuckles. "Why be a nomadic raider when you can be a king with a palace?" The arrangement worked surprisingly well. His warriors became our standing army. They married local women, and now, 3 generations later, his grandson sits on the throne, speaking our language better than his ancestral tongue. This story of Aramean chieftains transforming from raiders into rulers of settled communities played out across much of the former Hittite territory in northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia. Archaeological and textual evidence shows that around 1000 BC, many of the small city-states in this region came to be ruled by leaders with Aramean names, while gradually adopting a culture that blended Aramean and Hittite elements. It's one of history's recurring patterns. The nomadic raiders of one generation often become the established rulers of the next. "It makes perfect sense when you think about it," my political science professor used to say. Being a successful raider chief requires many of the same skills as being a king: military leadership, resource management, and the ability to command loyalty. In some places, this transition from raider to ruler was relatively peaceful, as in our fictional example. Town councils, desperate for protection in a dangerous world, essentially hired Aramean chiefs as defense contractors, only to find these contractors gradually assuming full political control. In other places, the transition was more violent. Aramean bands would capture a town by force, install their leader as the new king, and establish a dynasty through conquest. Whether by invitation or conquest, the result was the same. Across much of the Near East, new kingdoms formed with Aramean leadership atop a local population that still maintained elements of pre-collapse culture. Let's zoom in on one region where this pattern played out in particularly interesting ways: the area where surviving Hittite cities interacted with Aramean newcomers. When the Hittite Empire collapsed, not every Hittite city was destroyed. In parts of northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia, a collection of Hittite centers survived as independent city-states. These communities maintained Hittite cultural practices, artistic styles, and religious traditions even as the empire they had once belonged to crumbled around them. Archaeologists call these surviving pockets of Hittite culture Neo-Hittite states. They preserved elements of Hittite civilization, like distinctive architectural styles and the use of hieroglyphic Luwian script, for centuries after the empire's fall. But these Neo-Hittite states didn't exist in isolation. They were surrounded by the newly arrived Aramean tribes, and the interaction between these groups created something new and hybrid. Imagine yourself as a citizen of Carchemish, one of the most important Neo-Hittite cities. Located on the Euphrates River, it had once been a major centre in the Hittite Empire. When the empire collapsed, Carchemish managed to survive as an independent state, maintaining many Hittite traditions. You're a craftsman, a metalworker who creates bronze figurines for the temple. Your father taught you the traditional Hittite methods, and the religious icons you create look much as they did a century ago. But as you walk through the marketplace, you hear more and more Aramaic being spoken alongside the Luwian language of your ancestors. The clothing styles are changing too. Many people, especially the younger generation, are adopting elements of Aramean dress. The king's new advisor is an Aramean, your neighbour tells you as you browse a stall selling imported goods. They say he arrived with just 20 sheep and a bronze dagger 5 years ago. Now he has the king's ear and his daughter is marrying into the royal family. You're not particularly surprised. Over the past few decades, Aramean influence has grown steadily in Carchemish. Some city residents grumble about this, but most recognize a simple reality. The Arameans are now the dominant power in the region. Better to accommodate them than resist and risk destruction. This pattern, gradual Arameanization of Neo-Hittite states, is visible in the archaeological and textual evidence. By around 900 BC, many Neo-Hittite cities had Aramean dynasties ruling them, though they still maintained elements of Hittite material culture and religion. It was a remarkable cultural fusion. The settled urban Hittite tradition, with its monumental architecture and literary heritage, blended with the more decentralized tribal organization of the Arameans. The result was something that wasn't quite Hittite anymore, but wasn't purely Aramean either. We worship the storm god as our ancestors did, a Neo-Hittite priest might say, but now we pray to him in Aramaic as well as Luwian. While the Neo-Hittite states maintained elements of Bronze Age civilization, the Arameans were also creating entirely new kingdoms in areas where they faced less competition from established urban centers. The most powerful and stable of these purely Aramean kingdoms was Aram Damascus, centered on the ancient city of Damascus in modern Syria. From this base, Aramean rulers built a significant regional power that would last for centuries. The kingdom of Aram Damascus frequently appears in the Bible as a sometimes ally, sometimes enemy of the Hebrew kingdoms of Israel and Judah. The Aramean king Hazael, for instance, is described as a major military threat who conquered significant Israelite territory. Speaking of the Hebrews, their story intersects with the Arameans in fascinating ways. Some scholars believe that the Hebrews mentioned in the Bible were related to groups called the Habaru in earlier Egyptian records, essentially another group of pastoral semi-nomadic people similar to the Arameans. Like the Arameans, the Hebrews gradually transitioned from a more nomadic lifestyle to establishing settled kingdoms. Their trajectory paralleled that of the Arameans in many ways, starting as tribal groups operating on the margins of Bronze Age empires, then taking advantage of the collapse to establish their own political entities. So they're basically the same people? A student asked during one of my lectures. Not exactly, I replied. Think of them as analogous rather than identical. Both were originally non-urban peoples who existed on the periphery of the great Bronze Age states. Both followed a similar pattern of gradually becoming more settled and establishing their own kingdoms after the collapse. But they had distinct identities, languages, and religious traditions. The relationship between Arameans and Hebrews was complicated. Sometimes they were allies against common enemies. Other times they were bitter rivals fighting over territory, but they shared a common experience as peoples who had risen from marginal status to political prominence in the wake of the Bronze Age collapse. Despite the ongoing conflicts between these emerging states, many regions actually experienced something of a renaissance after the initial shock of collapse subsided. By around 1000 BC, parts of the Levant were enjoying what some historians call a golden age. With the great empires gone or severely weakened, local kingdoms had more autonomy. They were no longer caught in the power struggles between superpowers like Egypt and the Hittites. It was like being a small fish after all the sharks have left, as one of my colleagues colourfully puts it. Trade gradually recovered, though on a more regional scale than the globe-spanning networks of the late Bronze Age. New technologies spread, particularly ironworking, which became more common as the old bronze production systems collapsed. Bronze requires tin, which had to be imported from distant sources through complex trade networks. Iron, though harder to work with, could be produced locally in many regions. Some of these post-collapse kingdoms even began expanding and founding colonies. The Phoenicians, who had survived the collapse relatively intact in their coastal cities, established trading posts throughout the Mediterranean. The surviving Greek populations began recovering and eventually started their own colonization movement. It's a powerful reminder that collapse, while devastating, is rarely final. Human societies rebuild, adapt, and sometimes even thrive in the aftermath of catastrophe. Let's return to our Aramean shepherd-turned-king. A decade has passed since he accepted the invitation to rule the former Hittite town. He sits on a carved throne in what was once the governor's palace, receiving visitors and petitioners. The irrigation system in the eastern fields needs repairs, a village elder explains, bowing low. The canals have silted up, and we don't have enough men to clear them. The king nods thoughtfully. His people had never dealt with irrigation before. As nomadic herders, they followed the rains rather than manipulating watercourses. But he's been learning from the local farmers. Take 20 men from the guard rotation, he tells his commander. Help them clear the canals. The commander looks surprised. Those men are warriors, not farmers. They're both now, the king says firmly. Our strength isn't just in fighting anymore, it's in making this land produce food for all of us. This kind of practical adaptation was essential for new rulers who came from nomadic backgrounds. Traditional Bronze Age kings had centuries of institutional knowledge to draw on. Scribes, engineers, priests, and administrators who knew how to run a complex settled society. These new shepherd kings had to learn on the job, often relying on whatever local expertise had survived the collapse. In some cases, former raiders proved surprisingly effective administrators. They were pragmatic and unburdened by rigid traditions. If something worked, they adopted it, regardless of whether it came from their own cultural background or that of their subjects. My grandfather lived in a tent and counted his wealth in sheep, an Aramean prince tells his children. I live in a palace and count my wealth in silver and grain. Your children will probably count theirs in ways I cannot imagine. This adaptability, moving from counting wealth in livestock to understanding the economics of settled agriculture, was crucial to the success of these new kingdoms. Not all of these post-collapse states survived long-term, of course. Some were conquered by others, some collapsed due to internal problems or environmental challenges, but collectively they formed the bridge between the Bronze Age world that had died and the Iron Age civilization that would replace it. By 900 BC, roughly 300 years after the worst of the Bronze Age collapse, The political landscape of the Near East looked entirely different. Egypt had partially recovered but never regained its former glory. The Neo-Hittite and Aramean states controlled much of what had been the Hittite Empire. In Mesopotamia, Assyria was beginning a resurgence that would eventually make it the dominant power in the region. None of these states were as large or as interconnected as their Bronze Age predecessors. The world had become more fragmented, more regional, but it was also more diverse, with new peoples and new ideas coming to prominence. As you lie in your comfortable bed drifting towards sleep, consider the resilience this history reveals. Even after what seemed like the end of the world to those who lived through it, new societies emerged. People adapted. Life continued, though in forms that those who came before might hardly have recognized. But not all survival strategies involve creating new kingdoms or adapting to settled life. Some communities took a different approach entirely, retreating to defensible locations where they could maintain their independence and traditional ways of life with minimal outside interference. One such place was a rocky Greek island that had been a backwater during the Bronze Age, but would prove crucial to the eventual rebirth of Greek civilization. A place where farmers not only survived but thrived when almost everyone else was struggling just to stay alive. Let's turn our attention to Euboea, the island refuge whose story shows yet another path through the chaos of collapse. So far we've seen how Egypt survived through militarization, how mountain warriors seized their moment for revenge, how nomadic shepherds thrived in a broken world, how merchants navigated the chaos, and how new kingdoms emerged from the ruins. But there's another survival story that's perhaps the most surprising of all, one that happened on a quiet island that most people had never paid much attention to. Let's sail across the Aegean Sea to the island of Euboea, just off the eastern coast of mainland Greece. During the Bronze Age, this long, narrow island was a backwater in the Mycenaean world. While great palaces dominated places like Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos on the mainland, Euboea had no major administrative centres, no palaces, no kings, just farmers. Ordinary people work in small plots of land, growing olives, grapes and grain, raising some sheep and goats, fishing in the coastal waters, nothing special by Bronze Age standards. But sometimes, being unimportant is the greatest protection of all. Imagine yourself as a Euboean farmer around 1200 BC. Your day begins before dawn, like most farmers throughout history. The roosters haven't even started crowing yet as you step outside your simple stone house into the cool morning air. The eastern sky shows just a hint of lightning as you grab your wooden tools and head to your fields. Your farm isn't large, just a few acres of terraced hillside where you grow barley and tend olive trees. The soil is rocky, the terrain challenging, but it's yours, passed down through your family for generations. As the sun rises, you pause in your work, leaning on your hoe to catch your breath. From this hillside you can see across the narrow strait to the Greek mainland. There's something strange on the horizon, a column of smoke rising from the direction of one of the coastal towns. Another raid, says your neighbour, who's working the adjacent field. Third one this month. You nod grimly. For the past few years, disturbing news has been filtering across from the mainland. Palaces burned, kings overthrown, entire communities abandoned. Something terrible is happening to the Mycenaean civilization that has dominated the Greek world for centuries. Glad we're on this side of the water, you say, turning back to your field. That simple statement, glad we're on this side of the water, captures one of Euboea's key survival advantages. the narrow strait separating it from the mainland, just a few miles wide at some points, provided a crucial defensive barrier. While determined invaders could certainly cross it, the water created an additional obstacle that many struggling mainland communities didn't have. Water barriers were incredibly significant in ancient warfare, my military history professor used to emphasize. Before the development of large navies, even a narrow channel could provide substantial protection. You can't launch a surprise attack if your enemies see you loading boats, and if a storm kicks up during your crossing, your military campaign could end before it begins. But Euboea's geographical advantage wasn't just about the water barrier. The island's terrain itself provided protection. Much of Euboea is mountainous, with communities nestled in valleys or perched on defensible hilltops. The landscape naturally channeled movement along certain routes, making it easier to monitor and defend against intruders. Several weeks after spotting that smoke column, you're at a meeting of local farmers in your village's central square. The news from the mainland has gotten worse. Refugees have been arriving in small boats, bringing tales of destroyed cities and marauding invaders. We need to prepare, argues an older farmer, his face weathered from decades in the sun. What's happening over there could happen here too. But we have no palace, no great treasures, someone objects. Why would raiders bother with us? Hungry people don't need a reason beyond food, the old man responds, and we have that. The discussion continues until consensus emerges. The community will organize its own defense. Each family will contribute one man to a rotation of guards watching the coast. A system of signal fires will be established on the hills to warn of approaching boats. Food reserves will be stored in hidden locations. But who will lead us? Asks a younger farmer. We have no king, no warlord. The old man smiles thinly. That, young friend, may be our greatest strength. We'll lead ourselves. This grassroots organisation for collective defence represents something remarkable in the context of the Bronze Age. In the Mycenaean world, defence was typically the responsibility of palace-centred states led by warrior elites. Ordinary farmers were subjects, not decision-makers. But on Euboea, without palaces or powerful lords, communities organised their own protection. Archaeological evidence suggests that during this period, many Euboean settlements became more compact and moved to more defensible locations. Some constructed simple fortification walls. Storage facilities were built to withstand times of scarcity. All of this happened through local initiative and cooperation, not by royal decree. It was a bottom-up response to crisis, not a top-down command. We need everyone to participate, the village council declares. This isn't about protecting a king's treasure. It's about protecting our homes, our fields, our families. For the next several months, you divide your time between farming and guard duty. It's exhausting. The fields don't care that you were up all night watching the coast, but everyone shares the burden. Your wife takes on more of the farm work when you're on guard duty. Your teenage son helps construct a stone watchtower on the headland overlooking the strait. Then one night, it happens. You're on the watchtower with two other farmers when you spot them. 3 large boats approaching in the moonlight. Too many men aboard to be refugees. Too purposeful in their movement to be traders. Raiders, whispers one of your companions. Light the signal fire. Within minutes, the hilltop beacon is blazing, and others appear in sequence along the coast as the warning spreads. By the time the boats reach shore, the entire community is awake and armed, not with bronze swords or fancy armour, but with farmers' tools, hunting bows, slings, and determined expressions. The raiders, expecting to surprise sleeping victims, instead find themselves facing an organized defense. The fight is brief, but decisive. Several raiders are killed, the rest retreat to their boats and flee. Standing on the beach at dawn, surveying the aftermath, the village headman nods with grim satisfaction. They won't be back, he says, and they'll tell others that this island isn't worth the trouble. This scenario, while fictionalized, represents what archaeologists believe happened in many Euboean communities. The island experienced some of the same disruptions as the mainland. Trade declined, population shifted, material culture simplified, but there was remarkable continuity. Unlike in much of mainland Greece, where many settlements were completely abandoned, most Euboean communities adapted and persisted. The result was extraordinary. While much of Greece descended into what historians call the Greek Dark Age, a period of population decline, loss of literacy and cultural regression, Euboea maintained enough stability to become a launching pad for recovery. "Time makes fools of us all," your father used to say. You're thinking of those words now, 20 years after those first raiders were driven away from your shores. You're no longer a young farmer, but a community elder, with grey in your beard and wisdom born of difficult times. You're standing on the beach again, but for a different reason. A trading ship has arrived, not raiders this time, but Phoenician merchants from the east, bringing goods to exchange for Euboean products. "We haven't seen Phoenician traders in many seasons," you tell your adult son, who helps you run the farm now. "This is a good sign." "They say the worst is over," your son replies, "that trade routes are opening up again, that there are opportunities for those willing to take risks." You watch as the village craftsmen examine the Phoenicians' goods, iron tools, luxury textiles, exotic spices, things not seen on Euboea since before the troubled times began. The Phoenicians, in turn, are interested in Euboean olive oil, wine, and timber. The world is changing again, you muse. Perhaps it's time we looked beyond our shores as well. This renewal of external contact marks the beginning of Euboea's transformation from survivor to innovator. Archaeological evidence shows that Euboean communities, particularly Lefkandi on the west coast, were among the first in Greece to reconnect with the eastern Mediterranean after the collapse. They traded with Phoenicians and others, adopting new ideas and technologies. Most significantly, the Euboeans learned the Phoenician alphabet and adapted it to write Greek, creating the first true Greek writing system. This was a pivotal development, as the earlier Mycenaean script, Linear B, had been lost during the collapse. The Phoenicians make these marks on clay or papyrus, a merchant explains to a gathering of curious Euboeans. Each mark represents a sound, not a whole word. Once you learn the marks, you can write anything. Your son is particularly fascinated by this concept. Later, he practices making the strange symbols in the dust. "What use is this writing to farmers like us?" you ask, skeptical of the foreign innovation. "Father, don't you see?" your son replies excitedly. "With these marks we can record our harvests, our trades, our agreements. We can send messages to other villages without relying on memory. We can preserve our stories for those who come after us." What your fictional son grasped was the transformative power of writing, not just for record keeping, but for cultural transmission. As Euboeans adopted and spread this new alphabetic writing system, they laid the groundwork for the later Greek literary tradition that would produce works like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. But Euboea's role in the Greek revival went beyond writing. As conditions stabilized, Euboeans became among the first Greeks to establish overseas colonies. Around the 8th century BC, they founded settlements in Italy, Sicily, and the northern Aegean, spreading Greek culture and creating new trade networks. My grandfather never left this island, a Euboean captain might tell his crew as they sailed toward Italy. My father traded with the Phoenicians, and now we build new homes across the sea. Each generation ventures further. This incredible journey, from struggling to survive the Bronze Age collapse to leading the Greek Renaissance, makes Euboea's story particularly remarkable. The island went from backwater to trailblazer, from defensive isolation to expansive colonization. What made this possible? Why did Euboea thrive when so many other places failed? Part of the answer lies in what the island didn't have. Without a palace-centered administrative system, Euboeans didn't experience the catastrophic institutional collapse that devastated mainland centers. They had no complex bureaucracy to disintegrate, no specialized scribal class to disappear, no highly centralized economy to unravel. Instead, they had resilient, self-organized communities based around family farms and local cooperation. When crisis struck, these communities adapted without having to reinvent their entire social structure. The big palaces were like giant oak trees, an old Phoenician trader tells your grandchildren as they gather round to hear his stories. Impressive, mighty, but when the storm came, many were uprooted entirely. Your Euboean villages were like clusters of reeds, bending with the wind, sometimes damaged, but rarely broken completely. This metaphor captures something essential about resilience during collapse. Sometimes the most impressive, complex systems are also the most vulnerable when fundamental conditions change. Simpler, more flexible organizations often adapt more successfully. But how did people here survive when others didn't? Asks one of your grandchildren. The Phoenician smiles. They worked together. They weren't waiting for kings to save them. Each person did their part for the whole community. That cooperative spirit is visible in the archaeological record. Euboean settlements show evidence of collective projects, defensive walls, community storage facilities, shared religious spaces, all maintained through local initiative rather than centralized authority. Another key to Euboea's success was its balanced subsistence strategy. Unlike some regions that were heavily dependent on palace-organized agriculture, Euboean communities practiced mixed farming supplemented by fishing, herding, and wild resource gathering. When one food source failed, others could compensate. Never put all your olives in one jar, goes an old Euboean saying. The islanders lived this philosophy, diversifying their resources and spreading their risks. As the decades pass and you reach the end of a long life, you sit outside your stone house, now expanded and improved, watching your grandchildren play in the yard. The world they're growing up in is very different from the one you knew as a young farmer, facing the uncertainty of collapse. Trade ships regularly visit Euboea now. Some of your neighbours have grown wealthy from commerce. Young men occasionally leave to seek opportunities in the new colonies. The village has a temple now, and a marketplace where merchants gather. Someone has even started writing down the old stories and songs that were previously passed along only by memory. We've come through the dark times, you tell your daughter, as she brings you a cup of watered wine. Our grandchildren will have better lives. Because you and the others were strong, she replies, resting a hand on your shoulder. You didn't just survive, you kept who we are alive. That, perhaps, is Euboea's greatest achievement. The island's communities didn't merely endure physically, they preserved cultural continuity through the worst of the collapse. When other regions lost their connection to their pre-collapse heritage, their writing systems, their artistic traditions, their historical knowledge, Euboeans maintained enough links to the past to carry their identity forward. This cultural preservation, combined with their openness to new ideas from trading partners like the Phoenicians, positioned Euboeans to play a central role in the emerging Iron Age Greek civilization, a civilization that would eventually give rise to classical Greece. We kept the embers burning when the great fire went out, an old priest tells initiates at a sanctuary. Now those embers have kindled new flames. As you lie in your comfortable bed, far from the struggles of Bronze Age farmers fighting to protect their fields, consider how the actions of those ordinary people shaped the world that followed. Without the resilience of places like Euboea, the thread of Greek civilization might have been broken completely. The literature, philosophy, and democratic ideas that would later emerge might never have developed. Great civilizations don't just appear fully formed, they grow from the seeds planted by survivors of previous eras, people who carried knowledge, skills, and values forward through dark times. The story of Euboea reminds us that history isn't just made by kings and conquerors. Sometimes, the most important historical actors are farmers on small islands, organizing their own defense, adapting to changing circumstances, and keeping cultural memory alive when the great centers of power have fallen into ruin. But Euboea wasn't the final chapter in the story of the Bronze Age collapse. As the dust settled and new societies emerged from the ruins, one ancient survivor began to reassert itself, gathering strength, expanding its borders, and eventually creating an empire more fearsome than anything the Bronze Age had known. The Assyrians were coming back, and the world would tremble before them. That's where we'll pick up in our final chapter of this remarkable story of survival and transformation. We've explored how different groups survived the Bronze Age collapse, Egypt through militarization, mountain peoples through revenge and conquest, nomadic pastoralists through mobility, merchants through adaptability, new kingdoms through cultural fusion, and island farmers through cooperation. But there's one more crucial piece to this story, a survivor that would eventually become more powerful than any Bronze Age empire before it. I'm talking about Assyria. Picture a map of the Near East around 1100 BC, after the worst of the Bronze Age collapse. Most of the coloured areas representing great kingdoms have been wiped away. The Hittite Empire, gone. Mycenaean Greece, fragmented into tiny communities. Babylonia, devastated by repeated sackings. But in northern Mesopotamia there's still a solid patch of colour. Smaller than before, wounded but intact. That's Assyria, the empire that refused to die. Let's visit the Assyrian capital of Assur around 1050 BC. The city sits on a rocky bluff overlooking the Tigris River, its massive walls still standing despite decades of attacks from mountain peoples and Aramean tribes. Inside those walls, life continues with a sense of grim determination. In the royal palace, a scribe carefully records the king's latest pronouncement. Unlike in other collapsed kingdoms where writing disappeared, Assyrian scribal traditions never completely broke. Their distinctive cuneiform script continued uninterrupted, maintaining administrative and historical records through the darkest years. Record that we've driven the Aramean dogs back across the river, the king dictates, his face hard with the strain of endless conflict. Add that we have restored the irrigation channels they destroyed in the northern province. The scribe nods, pressing his reed stylus into the soft clay tablet. Both men know that the victory being recorded is modest compared to the grand campaigns of previous Assyrian kings, but they also know something that will prove crucial. Survival itself is victory when the rest of the world is falling apart. Assyria's story is unique among Bronze Age powers. Unlike the Hittites or Mycenaeans, they didn't completely collapse. Unlike Egypt, they didn't survive by radically transforming their political system. Instead, they contracted, pulling back from their imperial ambitions to focus on defending their heartland. "We abandoned the outposts we couldn't protect," an Assyrian general explains to his king. "We focused our strength on the core territories. Better to rule a smaller kingdom effectively than to claim vast lands we cannot control." This strategic contraction saved Assyria when other empires fell. By concentrating their military resources on defending essential territories, rather than trying to maintain far-flung provinces, they weathered the storm that destroyed their neighbours. Of course, survival came at a steep price. Assyrian records from this period, though they try to maintain a triumphant tone, reveal a kingdom under immense pressure. Royal inscriptions mention abandoned territories, destroyed cities, and desperate battles against Aramean invaders. Archaeological evidence paints an even grimmer picture. Many Assyrian provincial centres show signs of destruction and abandonment. Trade routes were disrupted, cutting off luxury goods and essential resources. Even in the heartland, some irrigation systems fell into disrepair due to constant raiding and population decline. An Assyrian merchant returning to the capital after a dangerous journey reports to royal officials, "The eastern roads are completely controlled by bandits now. No caravan can pass without a military escort. The western routes are even worse. The Arameans have seized all the water sources and demand impossible tribute for passage." The king nods grimly. "Then we will focus on the river trade for now. The Tigris, at least, we still control." This ability to adapt, to find alternative solutions when traditional approaches failed, was critical to Assyrian survival. When land routes became too dangerous, they emphasized river transportation. When certain resources became unavailable, they found substitutes or developed new production methods. Particularly important was Assyria's early adoption of iron technology. The Bronze Age collapse disrupted the complex trade networks that had supplied tin for bronze production. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, had been the primary metal for tools and weapons throughout the region. When tin supplies faltered, societies faced a critical material shortage. Iron had been known before the collapse, but was rarely used for common tools because it was harder to work with than bronze. The disruption of bronze production, however, accelerated the transition to iron technology, and Assyria embraced this change. "The iron ore comes from our own mountains," an Assyrian smith explains to his apprentices. "We need not depend on foreign traders who may never arrive. And iron, properly worked, makes weapons harder and sharper than bronze ever could." This technological transition wasn't unique to Assyria. It happened across the Near East and Mediterranean, giving the subsequent era its name, the Iron Age. But Assyria's quick adaptation to iron production helped maintain its military edge during the critical years of survival. Despite these advantages, Assyria's position remained precarious for generations. The Aramean incursions were particularly troublesome. These highly mobile pastoralists raided Assyrian territories repeatedly, retreating into the steppe when Assyrian armies pursued them, then returning as soon as those armies withdrew. Assyrian kings claimed victory after victory against the Arameans in their inscriptions, but these were often exaggerated. The reality was a grinding conflict that Assyria couldn't definitively win through traditional military means. "We defeat them in every battle," an Assyrian commander complains, "yet still they come, year after year." Eventually, Assyria was forced to accept a new reality. Some territories were now effectively under Aramean control, and others had become a patchwork of Assyrian and Aramean influence. Rather than continuing an unwinnable fight, pragmatic Assyrian rulers began a process of accommodation and assimilation. Aramean leaders who were willing to acknowledge Assyrian authority were granted official positions. Aramean troops were incorporated into the Assyrian military, bringing their mobility and desert fighting skills. Aramean trading networks were integrated with Assyrian commercial systems. Over generations, this process created a hybrid Assyrian-Aramean culture in many regions. Aramaic gradually became an important administrative language alongside Assyrian, eventually becoming the common tongue of much of the Near East. "My grandfather fought the Assyrians," an Aramean cavalry officer in the Assyrian army might tell his children. "My father made peace with them, and I serve in their forces. Each generation adapts to survive." This pattern, initial resistance followed by gradual integration, played out across the post-collapse world. The clear boundaries between different peoples and cultures that had existed in the Bronze Age became increasingly blurred in the Iron Age that followed. By around 900 BC, roughly 300 years after the worst of the collapse, Assyria had not only stabilized but begun to expand again. The Neo-Assyrian Empire that emerged would eventually conquer most of the Near East, creating the largest empire the world had yet seen. Under kings like Ashurnasirpal II and Shalmaneser III, Assyria developed new military technologies and tactics that made them nearly unstoppable. Iron weapons, cavalry units, partly adapted from Aramean traditions, and siege engines allowed them to project power more effectively than any previous empire. Ironically, many of the survival adaptations that Assyria developed during its period of contraction became sources of strength during its later expansion. The integration of Aramean troops, for instance, gave Assyrian armies greater mobility and versatility. The early adoption of iron technology provided superior weapons. The pragmatic flexibility that had helped them survive hardship made them more adaptive in conquest. "We learned from everyone who tried to destroy us," an Assyrian general might say, "and now we are stronger for it." The Neo-Assyrian Empire became notorious for its brutality toward enemies. Royal inscriptions boast about flaying captives alive, creating pyramids of heads, and mass deportations of conquered populations. Archaeological evidence confirms that these weren't just propaganda. The Assyrians really did employ terror as a deliberate strategy. This extreme approach may have roots in Assyria's experience during the collapse. The existential threat they faced perhaps convinced them that only overwhelming force could ensure security. Their memory of vulnerability became the justification for uncompromising strength. But the Assyrian resurgence wasn't just about military power. It was accompanied by cultural and intellectual developments as well. The Neo-Assyrian period saw magnificent palace construction, elaborate relief sculptures, and the creation of vast libraries, most famously the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, which preserved thousands of texts from throughout Mesopotamian history. In a sense, Assyria became both the last survivor of the Bronze Age world and the first great power of the Iron Age order. They maintained continuity with pre-collapse Mesopotamian traditions, while simultaneously creating something new and more formidable. As you lie in your comfortable bed, drifting towards sleep, consider what the story of Assyria and all our other survivors tells us about resilience and transformation. The Bronze Age collapse wasn't just an ending, it was also a beginning, the painful birth of a new world. The collapse cleared away old systems that had become rigid and vulnerable. It created space for new peoples, new ideas, and new technologies to emerge. The Iron Age civilizations that followed were shaped by the survivors we've met throughout this story. Egyptian military leaders, mountain warriors, pastoral nomads, adaptable merchants, cooperative island farmers, and of course, the stubborn Assyrians. Each surviving group contributed something to the new order. The Arameans spread their language and their decentralized social organization. The Phoenicians, who had weathered the collapse in their coastal cities, developed alphabetic writing and pioneered long-range maritime trade. The Neo-Hittite states preserved elements of Hittite culture that would influence later Anatolian kingdoms. The Greek survivors on places like Euboea maintained enough cultural memory to eventually spark the Greek Renaissance. Even Egypt, diminished though it was, continued to exert cultural influence across the region. And the resurgent Assyrians created new models of imperial organization that would influence all subsequent empires in the region. The survivors don't just endure, a philosopher might observe centuries later. They become the architects of what follows. This is perhaps the most important lesson from the Bronze Age collapse. Catastrophes don't just destroy, they transform. The world that emerged from the ashes of the Bronze Age wasn't a pale imitation of what came before. In many ways it was more dynamic, more diverse, and ultimately more influential. The Iron Age civilizations that grew from the seeds planted by our survivors would go on to shape the classical world. Greek city-states, Phoenician colonies, Aramaic-speaking kingdoms, and Neo-Assyrian imperial structures all contributed to the foundations of the world we would eventually inherit. Without the resilience of Egyptian military commanders holding their society together, or Euboean farmers organizing their collective defense, or Aramean shepherds adapting to settled life, or merchants finding new trade routes through chaos, or Assyrian kings contracting to survive, without all these survival stories playing out simultaneously, history might have taken a very different path. We might not have had the alphabets derived from Phoenician script, or the Greek philosophical traditions that grew from the cultural memory preserved on islands like Euboea, or the imperial systems refined by the Neo-Assyrians and adopted by subsequent empires. As your eyelids grow heavy and sleep approaches, imagine yourself as one of those survivors, perhaps a farmer on Euboea building signal fires with your neighbours, or an Aramean shepherd finding new grazing lands in abandoned territories, or an Assyrian soldier defending your homeland's narrowed borders. Their world was harsher than ours, their challenges more immediate. They didn't have the luxury of lying in a comfortable bed without worrying about raiders coming in, the night or crops failing due to disrupted irrigation systems. Yet they persisted, they adapted, they found new ways to live when the old ways failed, and in doing so, they not only survived, they created the conditions for new civilizations to flourish. The Bronze Age collapse reminds us that even the most catastrophic endings contain the seeds of new beginnings. That resilience isn't just about enduring hardship, but about finding opportunity in changed circumstances. That adaptation, cooperation, mobility, and pragmatism are often more important for survival than wealth or power. These are lessons as relevant today as they were 3,000 years ago, when the great palaces burned and desperate people sought new paths through a shattered world. As you drift off to sleep, safe and warm, the ancient survivors fade into the darkness of history. Egyptian military commanders, mountain warriors, pastoral nomads, resourceful merchants, island farmers, and determined Assyrians. Their world is gone now, transformed first by collapse and then by what came after. But their legacy remains, woven into the tapestry of civilizations that followed. Their stories of survival against impossible odds remind us of human resilience at its most elemental, the raw, uncompromising will to endure, to adapt, and ultimately to build anew from the ashes of what came before. Sleep well, and dream perhaps of those ancient survivors who helped shape the world we inherited. Ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges, whose collective resilience kept the flame of civilization burning through history's darkest hour.
Ensure our fortune for the season,
provided the shipments arrive safely through the northern pass.